Hi, everyone. Welcome to Interchange. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so very much for joining us. We have important things to talk about today. The problems in the Ukraine are headline news every single day, and things are coming to a head. But does it really have any effect on our lives here whatsoever? We'll talk about the outgoing superintendent of the Milwaukee Public School System handing out millions of dollars in bonus payments to teachers and support staff. What is that all about? And we'll talk about a suggestion from Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett that the speed limit on I-94 near Miller Park be lowered down to 45 miles an hour. Okay, let me introduce everybody. You know Joel McNally, longtime newspaper columnist. Gerard Randall, education consultant, local job creation expert. And of course, Denise Callaway, communications and public relations professional. Rick Horowitz is going to be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, let's talk first about the Ukraine. The residents of Crimea will be asked to vote soon on whether they want to stay with the Ukraine or become a part of Russia. Some people are shocked that Vladimir Putin is pulling the strings. Others are shocked that the United States and the West aren't doing more to address the situation. Is it really in our interest to get any more involved than we already have been? Is it any of our business at all? What do you think, Joel?
Well, it's certainly our business if there's any possibility of a war between the U.S. and Russia. I mean, this is the nightmare that we grew up with, right? So, you know, none of these, we are living in a global society now. We can't, you know, ignore anything going on anywhere pretty much because we found out we can get sucked into internal problems of other countries. In fact, we have just trying to complete 2 wars that have gone on for more than 10 years each just because of that. And, you know, so anything that, you know, puts us at odds with Russia is a whole nightmare scenario that none of us really want to think about. The most bizarre thing to me this week has been I think both Democrats and Republicans are intelligent enough not to want to escalate this conflict and not to want to say stupid things publicly that's going to get us drawn further into it. But the Republican Party is so obsessed with attacking Barack Obama on everything that first they have to beat up on Barack Obama and say he looks weak next to that great leader, Vladimir Putin. I can't believe, I have never heard Republicans in this country praise communist dictators before, but that's exactly what they've been doing. Like, boy, this is an example of a real leader. You know, whatever he says goes. Well, yeah. We used to say that that would be what would happen to us if communism took us over. But the truth of the matter is, you know, we all need to be very wary, and certainly our political leaders in both parties need to be very cautious. I believe that actually Republicans and Democrats are pretty agreed between the two parties that, you know, whatever sanctions we can do to make it difficult for Putin to, you know, invade another neighboring country that was once part of the Soviet Union, we should do it. And I'm impressed that, you know, the countries around the world are kind of united on that, except, of course, the European Union is very dependent on Russia in many ways, you know, for oil, for one thing. But they're united, and the U.S. is taking the position it should, and I think very cautiously trying to avoid, you know, escalating the conflict.
If in the next week or two the Crimean Peninsula reverts back to Russia, does it have any negative effect on anybody in the United States?
Yes, it does. I kind of liken it to Cuba jumping on Florida and claiming it as its own because they've got citizens that support Cuba through family ties in Miami. It's certainly in the Russians' eyes a lot more complicated than that because they've held sway in that area. They've got ports in that area. They have military bases that are there, and it allows them a launch point to secure their operations in other parts of Europe. I think what this situation has exposed are a lot of weaknesses in a number of arenas. First, in the international arena, the UN has been somewhat helpless in trying to deal with this situation. One, because they recognize that Russia has veto power over any move that it might make. The second is that China has been held at bay. They really haven't spoken out with any force in this situation. The rest of the community, as Joel had pointed out, particularly the European community, has recognized that their economies are so intertwined, as is our economy. Look at how the stock market took a nosedive here in the U.S. when this thing started to unfold. So we've got a heck of a lot at stake. China holds a lot of U.S. debt. And so it's very careful to want to make sure, I'm certain, that if there's going to be any military action, that it doesn't adversely affect their economy, or that if we're going to, and I think the number that's been bandied around is $15 billion, if we're going to sink money into the Ukraine to prop it up, that it doesn't all end up back in the Russians' hands because of the Ukrainian oil debt that they owe to the Russians. The second, and here's where I kind of part company slightly with Joel, is around our own, the American foreign policy. And I think there's a weakness there. There's a bit of a naivete that the Russians weren't going to make some kind of move to reclaim lands that had been a part of the Russian satellite at some point in the future. And we just simply weren't prepared for that. I don't know whether we are going to enter into this by utilizing military force. I can't imagine that we would, because we've already talked about how obnoxious we find intervening in these kinds of situations in the past. And yet we have such a long history in this country of being the military police, so to speak, for the rest of the world. And Russia has stepped in now, and I think they're trying to claim or reclaim some of that role that we used to have. So it's going to look much like the Cold War, the 50s and the 60s all over again for some time, as long as there's no military action involved, but a heck of a lot of posturing and certainly a lot of uncertainty in economic markets as this thing goes on.
Denise, this country is so war-weary right now, I can't imagine we would ever consider even putting one single troop on the ground there.
Well, I don't think we'd ever consider it, and I don't think we need to consider it. I do think that there seems to be a difference when we talk about whether or not we've been prepared or we've prepared well for what might happen in our response, whether or not our response has been appropriate. I think that people are not only in this country war-weary, we're also leery about stepping into conflicts before we know what they are. And I think there would have been great danger for the president saying, I bet this is what they're going to do, to step into a potential conflict and maybe escalate a conflict with Russia until we knew what Russia was going to do. And to be quite honest with you, Russia is, whether or not we agree with everything that they do, it's its own sovereign nation. And it has, just as we have experienced within our own country, the right to go into other countries based on pretense that they believe to be important, just as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and make those mistakes. The thing that I think is important to remember is that right now, Russia has not done anything it can't step back from. And I think what the president is doing is making sure that the United States doesn't do that same thing. We have imposed some sanctions. We have done some posturing. The Russians have moved troops in, but they've been quite, if you take a look at it, they have been incredibly strategic in how they've done what they've done and where they've placed people. So they've been very strategic in what they've done. They've not done anything that they can't pull back from. I think what the Russians are trying to do is to flex their military muscle a little bit. And certainly in this country, we've experienced that ourselves. They want people to begin to again see them as an important, critical world power that will take action when it feels like it needs to. At the end of the day, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see those Russian troops withdraw. You're going to see Crimea remain part of the Ukraine. But I think Russia is saying, and what Putin is saying is, We are a political power. We will step in where we need to step into. But quite frankly, the Russians don't want a war in this part of the world any more than we do, because who are the ones who are really going to suffer? We take a look at the ports there that are so close to Ukraine, the Russian ports that are so close there, that is one of their main channels to move oil. They don't want a disruption in that part of the world because it incredibly influences their economy if that happens.
All right, next topic. In the past few months, outgoing Milwaukee Public Schools Superintendent Gregory Thornton has handed out nearly $7 million in bonuses to teachers and support staff. Most of the payments were for just 1% of that employee's salary. Is this a sincere thank you for a job well done, approved by the board, or is it a way to get around Act 10, which prohibits collective bargaining over base wages not tied to any inflation? Or is it simply a tactic being used so the district can then forget about any sort of collective bargaining and the bigger pay increases that would likely result from a process like that?
Well, truthfully, from my own union experiences and background, I've always considered management bonuses to employees kind of a cruel trick because, in fact, they do not increase anyone's pay a cent. They don't increase your base pay. You never move ahead. You might get a bonus this year, or you might not, but your pay does not advance a cent. And at a time when inequality of income in this country is growing more and more, and at a time when, in fact, we should be recognizing the difficult job that teachers do and people in education do, we're not doing anything to negotiate even the limited amount of wage increases that are now allowed under Act 10. And instead, these bonuses are going out, which don't change anyone's base pay and does not advance people's wages a cent. It's nice to get the money, and believe me, if I were the employee, I'd take any money I could get, especially because they have been kicked around and kicked in the teeth in this state for the past 4 years. You know, I just say the important thing to remember is you should use every means possible to, in fact, increase the pay and benefits for the important job that education does instead of moving the other direction, and that this doesn't really make much difference in that.
So if I'm an employee making 50 grand, I open the envelope, I get a check for $500, do I say, this is fantastic, better than nothing, or do I realize, okay, this is my raise for the year?
Well, I don't know if either of those scenarios is what's going to happen. I think people will be appreciative of the reality that there are a lot of constraints that are placed on the school board with regards to how they can provide compensation to the staff in the district. You know, you're in the arena of public relations, I guess no good deed goes unpunished. And that's what this is. You have employees that you want to recognize for their work. You are in a system where you faced a lot of retirements. You faced a lot of people who have departed for other reasons. And you want to attract high quality staff to be a part of the education process in this community. And you can't do that unless people feel comfortable that they're going to be rewarded in some manner for the work that they do. And this was, I think, the best effort of the district to try to reward those folk for the work that they do, given the limitations that they have around how that can be done. Without, of course, bringing down the ire of the legislature, which, if it wasn't comfortable with how things are playing out, would have stepped in and imposed more constraints. So, yeah, I think people are going to be pleased with the fact that there was something, maybe not all that they would have liked, maybe not the opportunity to bargain more for other things that traditionally had been a part of the bargaining process. But when all is said and done, money is money, and if it's in your pocket, it's better than being in someone else's.
Denise, what about the critics that say, okay, this is $7 million that you didn't have to spend. This is $7 million that could have been put into the classroom?
Well, last time I checked, teachers, support staff, principals, assistant principals are critical parts and very critical components of what goes into the classroom. I think it's important to remember that we're having this discussion around Act 10, but the factors you have to really take a look at is not so much Act 10, it's what can you afford to do. And Gerard talked very well about the constraints the district finds itself in financially. This district is in much better financial shape than it was 3 years ago, but it still faces some tough economic challenges. So you have a choice. You have employees who have worked hard, many of whom whose contracts had expired, who weren't still receiving raises as part of that contract, who hadn't received raises in some cases for 5 years or more. At the same time, the number of people is shrinking and people are being asked to do more. So, what do? You do the best you can with what you have to really show people that you appreciate the work that they've done. You recognize the fact that these are folks who, have experienced less money in their paychecks every few weeks because they're paying more for their benefits. They're paying into their own retirement. How do you work to recognize and reward people and thank them for the hard work that they've done? But part of it is also that people have worked hard to earn this additional payment that came their way. So you have to take a look at the whole picture. And, a big part of that, as school districts around the state, certainly including Milwaukee Public Schools, saw tremendous cuts under this governor to the revenue that was coming in and the state aid that was coming in. You have to do the very best that you can to show the employees that you have that you appreciate them. For some people, it may not be what they want, but it's what the district can do.
All right, next topic. There was a very interesting suggestion from Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett the other day when he was asked about state plans to rebuild Interstate 94 near Miller Park. The state hasn't finalized a plan yet, but there's a great deal of resistance from the folks who live over there in the Story Parkway area. They fear loss of land, increased traffic. There's even been some talk of a double-deckered freeway there to handle increased traffic. Barrett thinks the state should drop the speed limit on that part of the freeway to 45 miles per hour, which he says would allow for a smaller freeway. When states around us are increasing interstate speed limits, does it make any sense for Wisconsin, even in a small area like this, to drop the limits to lower than they are right now?
You know what? When I first heard the mayor's comments, my immediate reaction was, he's a loon and it has no merit to it, because I just don't like Tom Barrett. But after I thought about it, and I'm familiar with that area, it actually does have some merit to it. The plan that so far has been floated by the state of either a double-decker freeway system or expanding the boundaries of the freeway so that you cut into those cemeteries that are over there. You've got veteran cemetery, you've got a Jewish cemetery that's nearby, you have a Catholic cemetery that's nearby. All these things matter. And when you start talking about Story Parkway, there are a lot of city employees that live over there, so I'm certain they've been bending the mayor's ear too. You got some journal employees that live over in that neighborhood, and I'm certain they've been on fire about the proposal as well. So when you start to think about that stretch of the freeway and dropping the speed limit down to 45, that's a small price to pay for saving a lot of land and perhaps even saving a lot of money. The reality of it is that traffic comes down to a near halt during morning drive times, evening drive times anyhow, and so 45 probably is never reached during peak drive times. And the other is that even at night or during those times when there aren't a whole lot of drivers out, somebody's going to make a lot of money on tickets because people will forget that the speed drops to 45, and you can bet that some municipality is going to be making a lot of money off of the increase in traffic fines going through that route. But I do think the mayor's idea should should be given some real consideration. It makes sense.
Okay, that's an absolutely beautiful neighborhood. The Story Parkway area is a beautiful neighborhood. But if I'm a state engineer, do I worry more about that beautiful little neighborhood, or do I worry about the hundreds of thousands of cars that are driven by people who don't live in that neighborhood that have to go through that spot every day?
You have to think about both, because how many times have we heard about plans that whether it's for something for road construction or for buildings that are being constructed, where there wasn't that thought given to the political reality of the fact that there's a neighborhood of very active, very vocal, very engaged Milwaukee residents who don't want to see this happen. You have got to think of both and figure out a solution. You know, as I look at people who are going west, I think to myself sometimes, wow, how great if we had a train that was going west to Madison and making a few stops in between, so we could take some of that load off of that highway. But of course, we don't have that. So I think you do have to find that delicate balancing act between what do you do to increase the ability for greater capacity in that space, but you have to do it within the confines of what you have. I just believe that the Story Hill folks are going to be able to stand up for their neighborhood, and you're not going to see that neighborhood change. You know, if they had their way, they'd peel it back another lane or two in each direction. So, I mean, that's reality. That is what you have. When you start talking about moving cemeteries and moving the remains of people's loved ones, I mean, that is another area where you don't want to go.
Right.
They've got to take a look at what options are. I agree with Gerard. I think that 45-mile-an-hour speed limit is something that has merit. I don't think I've ever gone as fast as 45 in that stretch of road.
But an interstate with a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit, isn't that like a city street then?
Yeah, I believe it is. But I don't even understand how it helps. I mean, I'm willing. I'm not a traffic engineer, and I'm not even going to play one on TV. I don't understand how lowering the speed limit changes the need to either widen or not widen or come up with other alternatives. I do agree with everything that has been said here about Story Parkway. That is a beautiful neighborhood, and it's a kind of neighborhood in a city you want to preserve. You don't want to try to come up with ways to destroy it and eliminate it. And the only reason why we keep talking about how are we possibly going to put more cars on that part of the east-west freeway is because exactly what Denise said. We haven't turned to mass transit in the area where it makes absolutely the most sense. We can't keep destroying great parts of the city because we're just going to pave the rest of the city for people that don't live here.
All right, back to the situation in Ukraine for just a minute. Lots of times when there's a foreign policy crisis, America's political leaders rally around the president. Some of that's certainly been happening, but Rick Horowitz wonders if everyone got the message. Rick.
Did you ever think you'd see a guy as smart as Lindsey Graham make spelling mistakes right out in public? I never did. He's way smart. But a tweet the senator from South Carolina put out just a few days ago, here, take a look. It started, when you kill Americans and nobody pays a price, you invite this type of aggression, #Ukraine. See the mistake? Right there, right there. He spelled Beirut wrong. He spelled it Benghazi. I mean, if you're talking about killing Americans and nobody paying a price and inviting more aggression, he had to mean Beirut, right? That's where terrorists killed not just 4 Americans, as awful as that was in Benghazi, but 241 Americans, Marines mostly, blown to bits in their barracks. Did we make anyone pay? Well, just 2 days after the Beirut bombing, that's Beirut as in Lebanon, the president launched a nifty little invasion of Grenada in the Caribbean. There were Cubans there building airstrips, and somebody was being mean to our med students. No, really. Terrorists attacked us in the Middle East, and we invaded Grenada. In Lebanon, meanwhile, nothing. The surviving Marines were quickly moved offshore and then out of the region altogether. So much for fighting back. That was 1983. The president was Ronald Reagan. Okay, so you don't want to blame Ronald Reagan for Ukraine? How about George W. Bush? After all, when Vladimir Putin first pulled the invade a former Russian territory stunt against Georgia in 2008, did Bush crack down? Not so much. Some economic sanctions, humanitarian aid, that's all. Or let's be bipartisan blamers. How about Bill Clinton, who pretty much sat still after 2 of our embassies were bombed in Africa in 1998? Nobody paid that time either. Maybe that's what led to Ukraine. Silly? But to think Benghazi did it, well, you'd have to believe that if Benghazi had never happened, Putin would have watched Ukraine slipping out of Mother Russia's grasp and said, no problem. Really? See, you can start the blame clock anywhere you want to if you're trying to score political points. Two things happened. The first must have caused the second one. The rooster crows at 6:31 and the sun comes up at 6:32. You think the rooster made the sun rise? Same thing with Benghazi inviting Ukraine. Just the latest pile of cock-a-doodle-doo.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Stay warm. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.